Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. If you can, leave a comment saying where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, because these stories tend to affect people differently depending on the hour. My name is Maya, and on this channel, I read stories sent in by people who worked night shifts in places that felt normal during the day, but followed different rules after dark. This story was sent to me by email. I don't know who wrote it, and I can't confirm everything that's described here. But the level of detail and the way this story was structured made me believe this person spent far too long trying to understand something that didn't make sense. If you have a story of your own and want to send it in, the email is in the description. Now, here is the story. I wasn't doing well when I found the job. I don't mean bad in a dramatic sense. I wasn't in crisis. I wasn't running from anyone. I was just exhausted. The kind of tired that settles behind your eyes and makes even simple decisions feel heavier than they should. I had lost my previous job 2 months earlier. Nothing scandalous. Budget cuts, restructuring, outsourcing. The kind of explanation that doesn't leave room for anger because there's no one specific to be angry at. Newark was full of people in the same situation. You could feel it everywhere, in the way conversations stopped halfway through, in how bars filled earlier than usual, in how everyone seemed to be waiting for something that never arrived. I spent my days sending out resumes and my nights awake, sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment, doing math that never added up, no matter how many times I redid it. It was in that state that I started accepting shifts I normally would have turned down. Temporary work, overnight coverage, anything that didn't ask too many questions and didn't expect me to pretend I had a plan. When I heard about the job at the port, I didn't think about danger. That's important to say, because people always assume you ignore warning signs out of arrogance or desperation. That wasn't it. I thought about routine. I thought about silence. I thought about something predictable, something that would move forward, whether I felt motivated or not. Night security sounded simple. Walking, observing, logging. The kind of work where the instructions don't change halfway through the night. Nothing heroic, nothing creative. Exactly the kind of thing you take when you don't want to think too much about where your life is headed. The administrative building where I interviewed was smaller than I expected, tucked away from the main traffic of the port. It looked more like a temporary office than a permanent structure. One of those modular buildings companies use when they don't plan on staying long. White fluorescent lights, clean floors, no decorations on the walls. A man who didn't introduce himself checked my documents and asked basic questions. Whether I'd worked nights before, whether I knew how to use a radio, whether I had any trouble following protocols. His voice was flat, professional, like he'd asked the same questions hundreds of times and stopped listening to the answers years ago. There were no strange questions, no hypothetical scenarios, no warnings disguised as jokes. No suspicious clauses buried in fine print. When he told me the hourly rate, I accepted before he even finished explaining the conditions. The number alone felt like an answer to problems I didn't have the energy to solve anymore. The first shift was described as experimental, just to see if I adjusted. No long-term commitment on either side. I was told to show up just before midnight, bring my ID, and wear dark clothing. That was it. No handbook, no orientation packet. I remember walking back to my car feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Not because the job excited me, but because for the first time in a while, the next day had a shape. The port at night looked different than it did during the day. Not darker in the obvious way, but emptier, stretched out. The scale of it was harder to process without the constant movement of trucks and workers. Containers stacked high enough to block out sections of the sky. Cranes frozen in place, their long arms silhouetted against distant lights. The air smelled like salt and oil and something metallic I couldn't quite place. It wasn't threatening. If anything, it felt indifferent, like the place would keep existing whether anyone paid attention to it or not. It wasn't until they handed me the radio and pointed to a piece of cardboard taped to the wall that I realized this job wasn't exactly like the others. The cardboard was old, edges bent, surface stained in a way that suggested it had been there longer than anyone wanted to admit. The writing wasn't uniform. Some lines were darker, pressed harder into the surface. Others looked like they'd been rewritten after being crossed out. It wasn't a manual. It wasn't a contract. It was a list. 5 rules. No explanation. Just instructions that didn't match a job that, up until that moment, had seemed completely normal. I remember reading them twice, then a third time, waiting for something to click into place. Rules, in my experience, usually exist to prevent obvious problems. Fires, trespassing, equipment failure. These didn't read like that. They read like responses, like answers to questions I didn't know how to ask yet. The man who brought me in noticed the look on my face and shrugged, like he'd seen it before. He didn't elaborate. He just said that if I followed them, the shift would be quiet. The first rule talked about areas marked differently on the map. Zones that weren't part of my assigned route, unless I was told otherwise over the radio. That made sense on the surface. Restricted access wasn't unusual in a place that handled cargo around the clock. The wording, though, was specific in a way that felt unnecessary. Like someone had learned the hard way what happened when you didn't follow it exactly. The second rule involved the radio. Not how to use it, but when not to. It mentioned static, not interference, not signal loss, but static, lasting longer than it should. It told me to turn the radio off for a precise amount of time if that happened. Not approximately, exactly. I remember thinking it was oddly detailed for something that sounded like a minor technical issue. The third rule referenced a specific section of the port and a specific time. After reading it, I checked my watch without realizing I'd done it. The rule didn't explain why. It didn't explain what would happen if you ignored it. It just stated the instruction like a fact, like gravity or weather. The fourth rule was short, too short. It described a situation I hadn't encountered yet, but suddenly found myself imagining too clearly. It told me what to do if it happened. More accurately, it told me what not to do. There was no follow-up, no emergency contact, just a line that ended abruptly, like whoever wrote it didn't feel the need to say more. The fifth rule was the one I read the longest. Not because it was complicated, but because it was personal in a way the others weren't. It referenced me directly, not my role, not my position, but me. I remember feeling a brief, irrational flicker of irritation, like the rule had crossed a line it shouldn't have known was there. I told myself that was stupid, that someone probably wrote it that way to make sure people paid attention. I signed nothing. I acknowledged nothing. The man just asked if I understood. And I said yes, because technically I did. I understood the words. I understood the instructions. What I didn't understand was why following them felt less like policy and more like superstition. Still, I clipped the radio to my belt, took the tablet they handed me for logging incidents, and stepped out into the night. The first hour passed quietly. Too quietly to be interesting. I walked the assigned route the way it was explained to me, checking locks, glancing at monitors, noting times. The port had a sound even when nothing seemed to be happening. A low hum that vibrated through the concrete, distant enough that you stopped noticing it unless it changed. I remember thinking that this was exactly what I needed. Something dull enough to let my mind rest. By 1:30, I had settled into the rhythm of it. Walk, stop, look, right, move on. The tablet stayed mostly empty. No alerts, no disturbances. The radio stayed silent, except for the occasional click, like someone brushing against the button by accident. I caught myself relaxing. The tension I'd been carrying for weeks, slowly unwinding as the night stretched on without asking anything of me. It was during one of those laps, as I passed near the edge of a section I wasn't assigned to, that I noticed the ground looked different there. Always wet, always reflecting the overhead lights at odd angles. I didn't stop to examine it. I didn't need to. I already knew what the rules said about that area, and following it felt easier than testing it. The clock on my watch ticked forward, steady and reliable, even when my sense of time wasn't. There were moments when I was convinced an hour had passed, only to check and see that it hadn't. Other times, I'd look down and realize more time was gone than I expected. I chalked it up to fatigue, to the way night shifts mess with your perception before you get used to them. Nothing happened that first night, and that, more than anything else, is why I came back the next one. The second night felt easier to step into. That surprised me. I expected at least a trace of hesitation, some lingering awareness of the rules taped to the wall. But instead, there was familiarity, the same badge reader hesitating for a fraction of a second before unlocking, the same low hum rolling through the concrete, the same smell of oil and salt settling into my clothes before the hour turned past midnight. Routine has a way of dulling things faster than fear ever could. I told myself that whatever unease I'd felt the night before had more to do with starting something new than with the job itself. People always get nervous when they don't know the rhythm yet. Once you learn it, the edges smooth out. That's what I believed. It's what I needed to believe if I was going to keep showing up. I followed the route exactly as instructed. Sector A, then B, then the long exterior corridor that ran parallel to the container yard. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, some brighter than others, casting uneven pools of illumination across the ground. Shadows stretched and collapsed as I moved through them. Nothing unusual, nothing worth nothing. I logged times. I checked locks. I listened to the radio breathe softly against my hip. By the third night, I stopped thinking about the rules constantly. They were still there, of course, sitting somewhere at the back of my mind, but they no longer felt urgent, more like background knowledge, the way you remember not to touch a hot stove without actively thinking about the burn every time. That was when they started to feel dangerous, not because they changed, but because I stopped paying attention to how strange they were. The port has a way of making you feel small. Not insignificant exactly, but temporary. Containers come and go. Ships arrive and leave. Cargo moves on schedules that don't care who's watching. Walking those routes night after night, I began to feel like another piece of equipment, necessary, but replaceable. There was comfort in that. The first time I noticed something that didn't fit neatly into that comfort came late in the fourth shift. I was passing the boundary of one of the zones marked differently on the map. Not entering it, just close enough to see where the lighting changed slightly, where the concrete looked older, more worn. I slowed without meaning to. Not curiosity exactly, more like my body responding before my thoughts caught up. I remembered the first rule then, clearly enough that it felt like someone had spoken it out loud. Don't enter without authorization. I stayed where I was. I adjusted my path and continued on, annoyed at myself for even hesitating. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. Just the steady hum and the distant water. I told myself that was the end of it. It wasn't. On the fifth night, the radio crackled for the first time in a way that made me stop walking. Not static yet, just a brief surge of noise, sharp enough to cut through the ambient sound of the port. I froze, listening, my hand hovering near the volume dial. Then it was gone. Silence rushed back in to fill the space it left. I waited a few seconds, then kept moving. I didn't log it. It hadn't crossed the threshold described in the rule. Not yet. The sixth night was when the static lasted long enough for me to count. Not consciously at first. It just stretched on, thick and uninterrupted, until I realized my jaw had tightened and I was standing still in the middle of the corridor. 1, 2, 3. I counted under my breath, eyes on the ground, pulse ticking in my ears. When I reached 21, I turned the radio off. 90 seconds is a long time when you're doing nothing but watching numbers change. I stared at my watch, resisting the urge to look around, resisting the urge to question why the silence felt heavier without the static than it had with it. When the time passed, I turned the radio back on. Everything sounded normal again. Too normal. I logged the incident exactly as instructed, using the wording from the rule, and moved on. That was the first time I considered not coming back. I didn't make the decision right away. I walked the rest of the route. I finished the shift. I drove home as the sky began to lighten, traffic slowly returning to the roads. By the time I reached my apartment, the unease had dulled, replaced by exhaustion and the familiar weight of bills waiting on the kitchen table. The money hit my account later that day. That settled it. The 7th night began like the others. Midnight, badge, beep, hum. I followed the route, logged times, listened. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I became aware of a sound that didn't belong. Not loud, not sudden, just persistent. A rhythm that didn't match the water, or the metal, or the wind. Footsteps. They were distant enough that I couldn't place them precisely, but close enough that I knew they weren't echoes of my own. I stopped and listened, holding my breath without realizing it. The steps continued, steady and measured, coming from somewhere ahead of me, somewhere I wasn't scheduled to be. I checked the map on the tablet. The area corresponded to a line of containers that hadn't been moved in months. I remembered the 4th rule then. Not the words exactly, but the feeling it left behind when I'd first read it. I logged the sound the way the rule instructed. Structural noise. Possible internal shift. No investigation required. Writing it down felt wrong, like I was lying to someone who already knew the truth. The footsteps stopped a few minutes later. Not fading out, just ending. The sudden absence of them made my ears ring. I stood there longer than I should have, staring down the dark corridor between containers, half expecting something to step into view. Nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to move on. After that, the nights blurred together. Not in the sense that nothing happened, but in the sense that I stopped reacting the way I should have. Static came and went. Sounds appeared and disappeared. The rules stopped feeling like precautions and started feeling like boundaries. Lines drawn around things I wasn't meant to understand. As long as I stayed inside them, the job remained manageable. The 5th rule was the one I thought about the least. Maybe because it felt too unlikely to matter. Radios don't usually call you by name, especially not full names. That kind of thing belongs in stories, not in real work environments. I convinced myself it was included as a catch-all, a way to keep people from responding to prank transmissions or crossed signals. That belief lasted until the night it happened. It was close to 3 in the morning when the radio clicked on by itself. Not a burst of static this time, not interference. A clear channel opening, sharp enough that it made me flinch. I waited for a voice that didn't come. For a few seconds, there was only breathing on the other end. Slow, deliberate. I told myself it was feedback. Someone leaning too close to a mic somewhere else in the port. Then the voice spoke. It said my name. Not the shortened version I used. Not a nickname. My full name, pronounced carefully, like the speaker wanted to be sure there was no mistake. My hand hovered over the radio, every instinct screaming to respond, to ask who was calling, to demand an explanation. Instead, I remembered the rule. I didn't answer. The voice didn't repeat itself. It didn't react. The channel closed with a soft click, like a conversation ending politely. I stood there long after, heart racing, staring at nothing, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I logged nothing. There was no instruction for that part. That was the moment the job stopped feeling survivable and started feeling conditional. I began to notice other things after that. Small inconsistencies I might have ignored before. Clocks that didn't agree with each other. Reflections that lagged a fraction of a second behind my movements. The sense that parts of the port were aware of being watched and resented it. Still, I kept coming back. That's the part people struggle with when I tell this story. They ask why I didn't quit, why I didn't report it, why I didn't walk away the first time something crossed a line. The answer is simpler than it sounds. Every night I made it through felt like proof that I could make it through the next one too. And every time I followed the rules, the port let me leave. Until the night it didn't feel like it wanted to. The night everything finally broke didn't announce itself. There was no shift in the air, no sudden sense of dread that warned me something different was coming. It started the same way all the others had. Midnight, the badge reader hesitating, the quiet, mechanical approval of the door unlocking. I remember thinking briefly that the familiarity felt almost comforting, like muscle memory taking over before fear had time to catch up. I followed the route, logged the times, let the radio sit against my hip, its weight constant and reassuring. The port hummed around me, indifferent as always. For a while, I convinced myself that the previous nights had been anomalies. Stress, fatigue, the human brain looking for patterns where none existed. That explanation lasted until the clocks stopped agreeing with each other. It was subtle at first. The digital clock near the loading bay read 3:41. My watch said 3:36. 5 minutes isn't much. Not enough to panic over, but enough to notice. I stopped walking and waited, eyes flicking between the two. The wall clock advanced. My watch didn't. I tapped it once, then again, as if that might remind it how time was supposed to work. One of the guards mentioned, almost casually, that the port's systems never fully agreed with each other after 3 in the morning. When it finally changed, it jumped forward by 7 minutes. I stared at it longer than necessary, feeling a tightness settle in my chest. I told myself it was a malfunction. Cheap equipment, low battery. The kinds of explanations that sound reasonable when you repeat them enough times. I logged nothing. There was no rule for clocks. The radio crackled again not long after. Static, but thinner this time, stretched like it was being pulled from far away. I counted automatically, my mouth forming the numbers without sound. When I reached 20, it stopped on its own. That was worse than if it had forced me to act. It felt like the port was reminding me that it could still follow the rules when it wanted to. As I moved deeper into the route, the lights began to behave strangely. Not flickering exactly, but dimming in sequence, one after another, like something passing beneath them. I stood still, listening, heart pounding, waiting for the pattern to repeat. It didn't. The lights returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. I became acutely aware of how alone I was. Near the boundary of one of the restricted zones, I saw a figure. At first, it was only a silhouette, standing between 2 rows of containers where there shouldn't have been anyone. I stopped immediately. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was irritation. Someone else was on my route. Someone had broken protocol. I raised the radio, already forming the report in my head. Then I hesitated, not because of a rule I remembered, but because I realized there wasn't one for this. Nothing on the list explained what to do if you simply saw someone where no one was supposed to be. The radio stayed in my hand, heavier than it should have felt. I lowered it slowly, my grip tightening until my knuckles ached. The figure didn't move. It didn't react. It didn't acknowledge me in any way. It just stood there, head slightly bowed, as if waiting. Not for me specifically, just waiting. I changed direction without taking my eyes off it. Each step careful and deliberate, afraid that any sudden movement might turn its attention toward me. When I finally looked back, it was gone. The absence felt worse than its presence had. The space where it had been seemed wrong, like something had been removed without closing the gap it left behind. I logged nothing. There was no language in the tablet that fit what I'd seen. I told myself that seeing someone and then not seeing them anymore wasn't proof of anything. People move, shadows shift. That explanation felt thinner every time I repeated it. The night continued, indifferent to my thoughts. Somewhere close to 3, my watch vibrated softly. The alarm I'd set early on to force myself to stay alert. I lifted my arm without thinking, and that was when I saw the time. 3:17. Everything in me stopped. Not just my body, my breathing, my thoughts. The low hum of the port stretched unnaturally, pulling into a single continuous sound, like a note held far longer than it should have been. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the numbers, afraid to blink in case they changed while I wasn't looking. When the watch finally moved forward, it did so reluctantly, as if dragged. The moment passed. The port released the sound it had been holding. Noise returned in fragments. Water, metal, wind, never all at once. I let myself breathe again, my hands shaking as the tension drained out of them. I told myself that was it, but I'd passed the worst part. I was wrong. The radio activated without warning. No static, no buildup, just a clean channel opening, sharp and immediate. I froze, every muscle locking in place. I knew what was coming before it happened. Knowing didn't make it easier. The voice said my full name. It didn't stop after that. It repeated it slowly, deliberately, like it was tasting the sound, testing how it carried in the open air. My throat tightened. My mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at me to answer, to say anything, to break the silence that felt like it was pressing in from every direction. I remembered the rule. I didn't respond. The voice changed then. Not in tone, but in content. It began describing things I hadn't said out loud. Details about my apartment, the kitchen table, the stack of unopened mail, the exact balance in my checking account that morning. Each detail landed with surgical precision, impossible to dismiss. It asked why I kept coming back. I wanted to say it was just a job, that it was temporary, that none of this meant anything. The words stayed trapped in my head, useless. The radio shut itself off, cutting the voice mid-sentence. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd heard all night. That was when I noticed the port felt different. Not angry, not hostile, expectant, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I understood then that the rules weren't there to protect me. They were there to condition me. I didn't finish the route. I didn't log the rest of the shift. I turned and walked straight toward the administrative building, every step requiring more effort than the last. The lights seemed farther apart now. Distances stretched in ways that didn't make sense. Corridors I'd walked dozens of times felt longer, their ends slipping away as I approached. I passed a reflective surface and caught my own image lagging behind me by a fraction of a second. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I fixed my eyes on the floor and kept moving, repeating the rules in my head like a mantra. The office door was unlocked when I reached it. That alone should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like permission. I stepped inside, heart racing, and closed it behind me. The building was empty. No guard, no supervisor, no sign that anyone had been there recently. I left my badge on the desk. The radio, too. I remember placing it there carefully, turned off, exactly where it would be seen. I didn't write a note. There was nothing I could say that would explain why I wasn't coming back. When I stepped outside, the sky was already beginning to lighten, dawn slowly bleeding into the edges of the night. I never returned to the port. Not to work, not to ask questions, not to see if any of it had been noticed. A week later, the number I'd been given stopped connecting. A month after that, I tried to find the exact section I'd worked in on a public map. It wasn't there. The port existed. The job, apparently, never had. It wasn't until weeks later that I found the radio again. I was reorganizing the closet in my apartment, pulling out boxes I hadn't opened since before I took the job, when I heard a faint burst of static from behind the coats. At first, I thought it was interference from a neighbor. Then I saw it. The same radio. Scratched casing. My initials still written on the back in marker. I stood there for a long time, trying to remember how it could have gotten there. I couldn't. There was no battery inside it. I still wake up sometimes at exactly 3:17. My watch lights up on the nightstand without being touched. On those mornings, I don't open the closet. I don't need to. I can hear the radio crackle softly through the door, just for a second, as if checking whether I'm listening. I don't answer. I've learned that much. I don't know if the rules were meant to keep something contained, or to teach people like me how to survive long enough to leave. I only know that I followed them, and the port let me go.